Good evening. Welcome to the Mob Museum. It's a lot cooler in here than it is outside, so you made a wise choice tonight. Our speaker will discuss a fascinating chapter of New York mob history, the story of a rogue group of hitmen known as the East Harlem Purple Gang. This gang was responsible for a string of vicious murders in the 1970s and 80s that drew widespread media attention. Unfortunately, the press coverage spawned a number of myths that made the gang seem even more ominous and frightening than it actually was. The truth was alarming enough, as our speaker describes the East Harlem Purple Gang as, quote, a farm league for the five families of New York City. Our speaker will be familiar to many of you. He has spoken at the museum a few times before, and he is a member of our advisory council. Scott Deitche has written 8 books on organized crime, including Cigar City Mafia, a complete history of the Tampa underworld, The Silent Dawn, the criminal underworld of Santo Trafficante Jr., and Garden State Gangland, the rise of the mob in New Jersey. Scott's most recent book, which is the focus of tonight's program, is called Hitmen, the Mafia, Drugs, and the East Harlem Purple Gang. And by the way, Scott will be signing copies of the book after the program out just beyond the doors. As usual, you'll have the opportunity to ask Scott a few questions after the talk. We'll bring around a microphone. This is important. We want to bring around a microphone before you ask your question so that not only everybody in the room can hear you, but also on the live stream. So that'll be our process. And so, okay, let's get started. Please welcome to the podium, Scott Deitche.
Great, thank you everyone. It's great to be back out here again at the Mob Museum. Let me just get set up here real quick, okay. So, we're going to talk about a group that for a brief period had a lot of notoriety, and it turns out that they're probably one of the more important kind of street gangs of New York City in terms of members of this gang eventually becoming bosses of some of the New York's 5 crime families. Now, I'm 50 years old, just turned 50 this past year. So I grew up when I was a little kid in the 70s, watched a lot of TV, like a lot of kids in the 70s did. And, you know, there were all these things that were coming out that I saw as a kid that scared me because they were really hyped up. For the longest time, I was scared of quicksand and killer bees and the Bermuda Triangle, the things as a kid in the late 70s that you saw on the news, and you were like, oh my God, this is the next, what am I gonna do? But there was also a spate there from 1977 through about 1979 when the Purple Gang that we're gonna talk about started getting headlines in newspapers across the country. A violent force in organized crime. The Purple Gang could trigger a mob war. Most of these were fed out of a couple major AP news stories, but before long, the myth of the Purple Gang started to spread. This was the group that was involved with 50 murders, 100 murders, 300 murders. Every other article, the numbers kept getting bigger and bigger. The Purple Gang's mob hit squad, the New York drug errand boys, and this was the succinct start of a lot of those. A killer corps of rogue cops and freelance mobsters investigated, linked to dozens of murders around the United States. So who were the Purple Gang? Well, to tell you who they were, we really need to start to talk about where they're from. And they were from East Harlem, New York, specifically an area kind of bounded over on the right, which a little bit closer to the water. In the early 1900s, this was the largest Little Italy in New York City, if not the country. A lot of people don't, you think of New York, you think of Little Italy, Mulberry Street and Lower Manhattan. But East Harlem was known as Italian Harlem. It had a huge Italian population. But throughout the ensuing decades, by the 40s, 50s, 60s, it started, the Italians started moving out of the area, but there was still a core group that was kind of centered around Pleasant Avenue And in fact, one of the most famous Italian restaurants in the United States do they still have the Outpost here in Vegas, I think? I think it was at Caesars, right? Yeah. Rayo's restaurant, the original one is at the corner of Pleasant Avenue, and it's you can't get into it. No reservations are booked forever. But this was the heart of this area. And a lot of the guys that were living in East Harlem ended up becoming some pretty significant organized crime figures. This is just kind of last year, just a view of Pleasant Avenue. Looks like a nice, idyllic little New York City neighborhood. But in these really ornate, nice homes, there's some really unique Mafia history. In fact, this suite of homes right here that you're seeing was headquarters of some of the earliest Mafia gangs. Clutch Hand Morello lived in one of those. Ciro Terranova, known as the Artichoke King, who controlled the artichoke market in the early 1900s in New York City, lived on this street. There were murders on this street. There were mob guys hanging out on this street. This was really kind of like a concentrated area for organized crime. Now, as the decades ensued, it kind of moved away from being known as a place where bookmakers and loan sharks hung out, and got a rather notorious reputation for drugs. And by the late 1960s, Pleasant Avenue in that area of East Harlem was the largest epicenter of heroin trafficking in the United States. And we're talking a street that's about 5 or 6 blocks, a very small street, and became known as the Pleasant Avenue Connection. And this was kind of the epicenter of the mob's heroin operation in the United States. And it was run by members of the New York crime families. And this was a surveillance shot from the book Pleasant Avenue Connection, which, by the way, is one of the mob collectible books. You'll be lucky to find a copy of it for under $300. But it's about how New York's narcotics detectives first discovered this giant heroin operation that was going on right on this street, right in broad daylight. I mean, these guys are outside during the day, because it was such an insular neighborhood, such an insular area, that it was kind of able to keep the police out of it, and they were able to run these operations without much law enforcement interference for a long time. And there were some big mobsters. Carmine Tremonti, the boss of the Lucchese family, was heavily involved in a lot of this heroin stuff going on. But law enforcement eventually was able to infiltrate. And in the early 1970s, there were a series of busts that occurred in East Harlem that pretty much put a major crimp in the mob's control of heroin. Now, real quick, just a quick segue to the side. One of the great myths in organized crime, one of the great myths about the Mafia, and I think it was really The Godfather that kind of brought that out, is that the Mafia were never involved in drugs. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Mafia have always been heavily involved in drugs. And especially during this time period in the early 1970s, that drug was heroin. And they were one of the major forces in heroin in the United States. So, that kind of the mob doesn't do drugs because it's not honorable. No, it makes them money, they're going to do it. But then you get a huge series of busts. This one alone, 86 people arrested. Major Mafia figures from East Harlem, from the Bronx, from other areas in New York are being swept up. They're being swept up, and in their place is a power vacuum. So you have all these older guys that have been running the streets for years. They're suddenly out of the picture. So now you have a little bit of an opening, and into that opening comes what we're going to talk about today, the Purple Gang. So these are guys in the early 1970s that are in their early mid-20s. These are young guys, and they're all of the same age cohort. Some of them are sons of the guys that are busted. Some of them have other relatives in organized crime. Some of them just grew up in the neighborhood. But they kind of step in and start taking over some of the remnants of these drug operations. But before we get too much into them and some of their activities, I want to talk a little bit about the name, the Purple Gang. So for people that like mob stuff, you might have heard the name the Purple Gang. And the original Purple Gang refers to a group of Jewish mobsters in the 1920s and 30s, especially during Prohibition in the Detroit area. They got the name the Purple Gang. And all of a sudden, this new group that starts out of East Harlem, nowhere near Detroit, has this name the Purple Gang. So one of the first things I wanted to do is find out, how did the name the Purple Gang become attached to this group? So I read a bunch of newspaper articles that said law enforcement were the ones that called them the Purple Gang. And then I read law enforcement reports that said newspapers called them the Purple Gang first. And then I talked to a couple people in the neighborhood. One in particular says, I know exactly how they got the name the Purple Gang. They saw the Purple Gang movie on TV and said, we're going to call ourselves that. Another one said they used to wear purple flowers when they went out in their suit. Long story short, I think it's been lost to time exactly how the name the Purple Gang got attached to this group of gangsters. But what's interesting is whether it was a media creation or whether it was a creation of law enforcement or just some vernacular on the street, it stuck. And it started becoming the name that they call themselves. In fact, a lot of more recent mobsters I know that I've interviewed, ex-mobsters, they say, oh yeah, we knew about the Purples or the Purple Gang. So this name that nobody really knows where it came from suddenly became the name that was attached to this group of guys. The other thing I wanted to do is was the Purple Gang really a tightly connected group of people, or was it just kind of a name that was thrown around? And that was interesting because a lot of times you'll hear about groups in the Mafia, Murder Incorporated. You'll hear about these groups of hitmen or this group or that group. You're not really sure if everyone they name is part of that group. So I really wanted to know, these guys that got attached, this name the Purple Gang, did they really work together? Were they really part of this syndicate? So I found a really interesting paper by a gentleman named Peter Lupshaw. He's a criminology professor at the University of New Mexico. And in the early 80s, he used the Purple Gang for a somewhat scientific experiment in network analysis. Now, I am a scientist by day, and I could go into real detail about network analysis and data, but I'm not going to. We're going to stick to the good stuff. But one of the things he did was look at how these guys got together, how they became a gang, how they started working together. And he used a couple things. Number one is, these are some maps from his study. You'll see names of, they all lived by each other. They all hung out by each other. They all worked in businesses in this same neighborhood. So there was that geographic connection. And then there was a familial connection, like this chart here. And these guys are all tied, whether they're family members, whether they're brothers, whether they're cousins, whether they're neighbors. And through this study, he was able to determine, yeah, this is a real group of guys that grew up together, and the Purple Gang is really an entity in organized crime. A couple of the members on the left, the Danbury, Connecticut, that's Frank Vicerto Jr. His father was an associate of the Genovese family, and Frank Vicerto Jr. became one of the more kind of core members of the Purple Gang in the 1970s and into the 80s. His main area of operation was drugs, heroin, some cocaine, but primarily heroin. We'll talk about him a little later. He was also involved in some of the violence that was associated with the Purple Gang. The gentleman on the right is Paul Kiano. He's another guy, grew up around these guys in East Harlem, became a member of the Purple Gang. The gentleman on the left, obviously that's not a 1970s photo of him, but that's Matthew Madonna, who we'll talk about him later a little bit, a major member of the Lucchese crime family. But back when he was in his when he was much younger in the early 1970s, He was one of the major heroin suppliers to Nikki Barnes, one of the largest African-American drug kingpins in the 1970s. And some of you might have heard the name Nikki Barnes. He kind of was a larger-than-life character in Harlem, and it showed how closely the Mafia and the African-American kingpins were working together at that time, especially in East Harlem and Harlem. So you have this time, again, early 1970s. The old heroin dealers are out of the picture. They've all been arrested. This young group of the Purple Gang come in, and they start taking over. They start taking over territory. They start taking over operations. They're young. They're wild. There's drugs involved, and there's money involved. The result of that is violence, a lot of violence. And there's this surge of violence that occurs first internally in the gang. And there's a lot of victims, but we're just going to go through a few of the more notable ones. So this is a picture of Philip Manfredi. So Philip and his cousin Philip, their uncle was a mobster named Jojo Manfredi. He was a capo in the Gambino crime family, and he was heavily involved in heroin. Phil, his cousin Phil, and their uncle Joe were arrested by New York police, and while waiting trial, Phil and his cousin one night after dinner said, "We have to go meet a guy about a thing." So they took off in their car, they picked up somebody. They were both in the front seat and that other person was in the back seat. They pulled off the side of the road in the Bronx. The next thing, the police come a few hours later, the car's running. Philip is there, shot in the back of the head, and the other Philip started to run and got shot in the back, was found just outside the front of the car. So the person they picked up was the gunman. And that person was a guy named Joe Della Valle, who was a member of the Purple Gang. So these Manfredis were involved with the Purple Gang. Now, this kind of violence didn't go unnoticed by law enforcement. In fact, and let me pull it up here because I want to get the exact quote. The DEA said in a report about the Purple Gang, much like the original Purple Gang of Detroit, the members of this current group have an enormous capacity for violence. So they already were starting to make a name for themselves on the street. Edward Rand, another close associate of the Purple Gang, who is also heavily involved in heroin operations. They found his cab right on this street in the Bronx. His body was found by some kids playing in the nearby woods a few weeks later. No suspects, there was a suspect. He was a member of the Purple Gang, but no arrests made in this killing. George Teutoyan, his body was found here December 24th, Christmas Eve, 1973. This is a back alley in the Bronx, and this is a photo, not a year old, and still looks like a place you'd probably dump a body. He was shot twice and stabbed 14 times. So these were violent killings. This wasn't just a clean shot, one and done. These were violent guys that were violently killing, and a lot of the times each other. So this one in particular was interesting. So these guys hung out primarily in Manhattan, and they liked to hang out in nightclubs. One of the Purple Gang's favorite nightclub was a live music venue called the Alibaba Club on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, kind of a swankier neighborhood than they're used to. One night in October 1st, 1974, John Monk and Zisi and an Irish drug dealer from the Bronx are in the Alibaba. An unknown gentleman comes in through the front, walks to the back and says, "Where are you, little rabbit?" "Oh, I see you." And he pointed to John and his fellow drug dealer and said, "I got you now, rabbit," and started shooting them. And this is the body of John, 2 gunshots to the back. The gunman walked out. Again, no suspects. No one was ever charged in the murder. So these are all internal killings that are taking place as the gang kind of tightens their ship and starts taking out some of their competition. Then there's a spectacular double killing, and this killing kind of shifts things for the Purple Gang. In April 4th, 1976, so I'm going to try to explain this to you because it's a little confusing. So Anthony Maiorino walks into this, which is now a travel agency, but this was a lounge, the Capri Lounge. He walks into the lounge, and Leonard Philippone is already in the lounge. Leonard sees Anthony walk in, and because of a previous beef they had, walks up to him, shoots him dead. As Leonard walks outside, somebody else from inside the bar starts chasing Leonard. So he runs around the corner and gets shot and killed outside the bar. So two members of the Purple Gang basically came to a head and were both killed right outside this bar. Now, this kind of changes the dynamic because there's all this wanton violence internally when guys are getting killed. You start seeing a little bit of a change. You start seeing some of the older members of the gang say, we maybe need to back off the pedal a little bit about killing each other, maybe kind of get our stuff together. So around 1975, 1976, especially after this killing, the gang kind of shifts a little bit, becomes a little bit more rigidly structured, a little bit more kind of cohesive. And then you start seeing people like Frank Vicerto, like the Meldish brothers, like the Priscos, and we'll talk about them a little bit later, come into the fold. So you kind of see the group kind of growing up a little bit. Doesn't mean they're totally done with the violence. This one's a little self-explanatory, what happened to little Arthur Fiore. He was a low-level mob dealer. He was associated with the Purple Gang. And yeah, his head was found up by LaGuardia Airport, and his body was found down in Maspeth, Queens. So around 1977, the Purple Gang start becoming a little bit of a known entity. Part of that is from media. Part of that is from these articles about the Purple Gang. But they stem from another series of killings, but this time it's not within the Purple Gang. These killings kind of become mob lore. They're called the 22 caliber killings. And in fact, this is how I got interested in this topic in the first place. There was a New York Magazine article about the 22 caliber killings. And these were a series of killings that all used a 22 caliber pistol like the one you see here. All of the guns used in these killings were traced to a shipment of guns that the Purple Gang, specifically Frank Vicerto, bought in Broward County, Florida, and shipped up to New York. And he gave them to the Genovese crime family, and they distributed them among some of their hitmen, and members of the Purple Gang had some. So you have all these killings all of a sudden again, another spate of killings that take place in 1976, 77, 78. All of the guns trace back to the same source, and in fact, in a number of these, the same gun was used to kill multiple people. And this is all from the Purple Gang. Arthur Milgram. Arthur Milgram was the head of the New York State Lottery. He decided he wanted to go into business with Frank Vicerto because he thought he was a legitimate businessman. Instead, a majority ownership consortium of Purple Gang members got into business with him. And basically, they were trying to infiltrate the New York Lottery. And when Arthur started balking at it, there he is there, 7 shots with a 22 caliber pistol. And this really started making news, and this is when the Purple Gang starts really coming on law enforcement radar. The DEA in 1977 releases a comprehensive report identifying all the members and really kind of sets this template for law enforcement now to start going after these guys before they get even more out of hand, before things get even more crazy. But the killings continue. James Kelly, he's a Newark school principal. He also hangs out in gambling dens in the Down Neck section of Newark. And for those of you that are from Jersey, the Down Neck section is primarily a Portuguese, Italian neighborhood in Newark. James Kelly used to hang out in the gambling dens. He ran afoul of some Genovese Purple Gang associated guys. He was shot and killed. The gentleman on the right was a master wiretapper who was going to turn state's evidence against members of the Genovese family, and his killing was contracted out supposedly to members of the Purple Gang. And finally, the last one I'll really go into detail about. This is the killing that got me interested in the Purple Gang in the first place. This is Johnny Coca-Cola Lardiere. He was a well-known New Jersey mobster. And he was in prison, and he got a weekend furlough. And he pulled up to a motel in Bridgewater, New Jersey. And a gentleman came up to him and raised a gun. And famously, Johnny said, "Well, what are you going to do now, tough guy?" And he killed him. He shot him. Multiple .22 caliber shots. This gun was traced back to that same batch that the Purple Gang had brought up from Florida. This gun was also the same gun used in multiple other murders, and this was confirmed by the FBI through ballistics. So the Purple Gang had now graduated from killing each other over beefs over heroin and territory and money to now they're becoming hired guns. And they're also supplying guns to other hitmen for organized crime. This is a violent time too. When you think about violence and organized crime, right downstairs are the St. Valentine, upstairs, I'm sorry, the St. Valentine's Day Massacre wall. You think about the Prohibition era and how violent the mob was, but the 70s were another era where there was just a ton of violence, and a lot of the violence that was going on, especially in New York, could be attributed to these Purple Gang members. So as the 70s kind of start to bleed into the 80s, things change a little bit again with the gang. They start getting formally inducted into the Mafia. Some of them start becoming made members of the Lucchese family, of the Bonanno crime family, of the Genovese family. But there's still some Purple Gang guys out there that are active. There are members of the Purple Gang that aren't Italian, so they can't be members of the Mafia. And there's still a little bit of activity going on that is getting in the way of the mob liking to stay under the radar. In fact, it's hard to read, I know, but I'll read it for you. This is from December 11th, 1981. Sources advise that the Gambino and Genovese crime families continue to have serious problems with the Purple Gang from East Harlem. In fact, they had a meeting of the hierarchy of the Genovese and Gambino family to talk about the Purple Gang and these young kids and the violence that was going on. So what they started doing was they started inducting them into the crime family. They started bringing them into the Mafia. This way they could control them. So now you start seeing the gang start to splinter. So this gang that just 6 years earlier was just running crazy throughout New York are now being brought into the Mafia, are now being brought into more sophisticated criminal rackets, are now being kind of, I can't say taken off the street because they're still in the street, but they're being groomed to take higher level positions in organized crime. And because of this, the violence attributed to the Purple Gang really starts to decline. And in fact, by the mid-'80s, you don't hear about any killings attributed to the Purple Gang. The other thing you don't get is you don't get a lot of the media anymore. So I actually did a newspaper's search. So from 1977 to 1980, there was close to 1,000 mentions of the Purple Gang in the newspaper. And I was very clear not to capture the Purple Gang, as that was the nickname of the Minnesota Vikings at the same time, so I made sure that that was not part of it. But when we look into the 1980s, that number drops significantly. That number drops to maybe half a dozen mentions in a decade. So the Purple Gang going, again, from this 1970s, this is the biggest story. These guys are going to be the new Mafia. They're going to just run red streets with blood, and then nothing. They're gone. Because the Purple Gang themselves kind of started going a little bit under the radar. In fact, some of them went under the radar very deeply, and people didn't even realize that they were still active on the street. One of those gentlemen, Joseph Meldish, him and his brother Michael Meldish were members of the Purple Gang, very violent in the 1970s. Then things kind of quiet down. Their names pop up here and there. But in 1999, Joseph Meldish is involved in a shooting at a Bronx nightclub. And he is arrested and in 2011 sentenced 25 years to life. And he's still in prison to this day. The interesting thing about Joseph Meldish, though, is when he was arrested, all the newspaper articles, and I have the tallies written down. I read 4 different newspaper articles. One said he was responsible for 30 gangland murders. One said 40. One said 70. And one said over 100. So in my research in the book and looking, he was implicated in, I found about a handful of murders in the 1970s through the Purple Gang, and certainly the murder he was convicted for. But again, just kind of showing a little bit of that mythology that's developed over these members, even 20 years removed from when they were really kind of the focus of law enforcement and the media. Now they start gaining that real mythology, mythological aspect. And again, I'm talking to guys like, I interviewed like John Panisi, I interviewed, some other people, and they'll be like, these are ex-wise guys now, and they're like, oh yeah, I heard he killed hundreds of people. And, so the myth grows over the years. But the Purple Gang did come back in a big way in November in November of 2013. And that was the killing of Michael Meldish up in the corner. So Michael Meldish was probably one of the last real known Purple Gang leaders that were still involved in illegal activity on the street. But he wasn't, because he wasn't Italian, he wasn't a made member of the Mafia. But he was still known as a criminal. He was still involved in drugs. He was arrested in the 90s for drug trafficking. And in November of 2013, he was killed on this street in the Bronx. It made the papers the next day, the Daily News, the New York Post, the New York Times. They called them the head of the Purple Gang, or the last Purple Gang member shot and killed. And this was a pretty big story in the New York papers, especially because mob hits aren't that common anymore. And to have this guy tied to this very violent mob gang of the 1970s, all of a sudden in 2013 getting killed, what happened? And in the subsequent investigation, they found that Michael Meldish was still active, and he was involved with not only the Bonanno crime family, but the Lucchese crime family as well. So investigators started putting together a pretty large RICO case. And they charged this gentleman on the far left, Terrence Caldwell, with actually pulling the trigger. Christopher Landino, the middle gentleman, as also involved in the murder and was there that night that Michael Meldish was killed. And the gentleman on the far right is Stephen Crea. He was the one-time acting boss of the Lucchese crime family. So they're looking to net the Lucchese crime family hierarchy into this massive RICO case. Now, the other big name in this case was another old Purple Gang member, Matthew Madonna. If you recall, he was a gentleman in the 1970s that was supplying heroin to Nikki Barnes on the streets of Harlem. Well, in the mid-1970s, he was sentenced to over 30 years in federal prison. And he got out in the late 90s and immediately was brought in to the Lucchese crime family and eventually rose to the rank of acting boss. And he was probably the biggest name ensnared in this case. And everyone was found guilty, and I believe everyone was sentenced to, if not life in prison, pretty much, especially for someone like Madonna at his age in 80s, effectively life in prison. And one of the interesting things, as a result of the Michael Meldish murder, it spawned a lot of ancillary investigations, some of which are still even being tried today. So the reverberations of the killing of the last, big Purple Gang guy that was not involved with the Mafia really is kind of leading to a bunch of Mafia convictions. But, I said he was kind of referred to as the last Purple Gang member, but he wasn't. There were still some of those guys that were made into the Mafia. And a few of them went up to pretty well-known positions. Angelo the Horn Prisco. So Angelo Prisco and his brother Pasquale Prisco, they were core members of the Purple Gang in the 1970s when they were young. And I found all these law enforcement reports of them getting involved in brawls, in fights. They were named as suspect in some of the killings that were taking place in New York in the 70s. These were really tough guys. And Angelo Prisco in the early 80s became a made member of the Genovese crime family. And in fact, he eventually rose up to the rank of capo in the Genovese crime family. He died in prison in 2017. He was primarily based out of New York, but he was head of a crew of Jersey guys for a while in the Genovese family. Another Purple Gang member that grew up with these guys that were involved in a lot of the activities in the 70s was Danny Leo, Danny the Lion Leo. He was also the one-time acting boss of the Genovese family. He was released from prison in 2013, and he's still alive. He's still active. And again, this is a guy that grew up in East Harlem and rose to pretty high ranks in the Mafia. And Mikey Nose Mancuso, this is 2022. This was a photo the New York Post just took a couple months ago. He's allegedly the current boss of the Bonanno crime family. And Mike Mancuso was a Purple Gang member. He was involved in some of the shootings and killings, but never charged for them. And he was also very close to a lot of the core guys of the Purple Gang. So again, you start with this gang of 20-somethings in the 70s. They kind of start to grow up, and they get real jobs in the Mafia, and then they get into senior management. It's, it's a career path is what it is. It's a career path. This was kind of a fascinating topic for me to research because, I've always looked at writing about the things that nobody's written about in the Mafia. And everyone's talked about the Purple Gang in the Mafia researcher world. But when I was doing my book, Garden State Gangland, I was reading about the murder of Johnny Coca-Cola. And that turned me on to this .22 caliber killings. And I started reading about the Purple Gang. And this was a little bit different. Most of the books that I've done and the research I do, I start with a lot of information and have to kind of winnow it down. This one I started with very little and had to kind of push it out and find new stuff. And it was challenging, but really rewarding. And I think in this book, I used probably the most references and sources I've used in a book. I think I had something over 400, maybe 425. So it was a very interesting book to really kind of find new stuff out about this mob group that a lot of people haven't really heard of outside like our mob geek community, and nobody's ever written about. So that's why I decided to jump in on this topic. And it's both historic and current because, as I said, a lot of those reverberations of what the group did back then are still being felt in the underworld today. So with that, and in a little bit of a homage to a couple great actors that we lost recently, we'll open it up to questions. And Jeff will bring the microphone around if anyone has a question.
Maybe I'll ask the first question to kick it off. So I think, Scott, that since the book's been published, you've had opportunity to talk to a few other people you didn't get a chance to talk to for the book. Is that true? Who had some involvement with this? Yeah, so that's become a thing with my books. Is I'll write the book, then people will be like, "Oh wait, you forgot this story. Let me tell you what happened." But I did especially actually weirdly over the last 2 weeks, maybe since this program was announced. People have reached out to me that grew up in East Harlem. I just had a guy that reached out to me the other day that were friends with some of the Purple Gang members in the 1970s. He wasn't involved, but I'm going to be talking with him, and he's going to share some stories. One of the gentlemen I talked to who just recently passed away was Robert Geronimo, and he was involved with Nikki Barnes in some of the drug smuggling and drug trafficking activities in Harlem in the 1970s. I actually was able to talk with him
while I was researching the book, and he gave me some great stories. So I always like the research and digging through the files, but I always like talking to people, even if they didn't directly know or just have anecdotal stories. I think it helps me get the story better and get a better feel for the area. The one thing I do like to do that I wasn't able to do on this book is I also like to visit where I'm writing about. So I've been to East Harlem before, but I really wanted to go there while I was writing this book, kind of walk the street, look at some of the buildings. Unfortunately, I wrote this book in 2020, so traveling was was off the cards, so I wasn't able to do that. But instead, I found some people that grew up in East Harlem that had written about it, so I talked to them at length about what it was like just growing up as a kid there. And there's pretty active Facebook groups of people that grew up there, especially in the Italian community, so that was really helpful.
Hi. Very interesting, by the way.
Thank you.
East Harlem, the Purple Gang, but wasn't there a Detroit Purple Gang
Yes,
earlier? Was there
yes.
any relation between the two?
Yes, I think you missed that. I said at the beginning. Yeah, the Detroit Purple Gang was wholly different. They were active during Prohibition, and really this was just this group getting attached with that name, kind of an homage to the old original Purple Gang. Yeah.
Here you go. I'll do another one.
I was just wondering how they were able to operate for all those years. Did they have to pay up to one or more of the 5 families, or how did they sort of stay independent all those years?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, you had these group of guys that are kind of acting on their own, kind of causing headaches a little bit sometimes for the 5 families. So some of them were related to mob guys, so I think there definitely was some kicking money up, so they don't get in trouble with the mob. There was also a lot of police corruption at that time. This is the era of kind of Frank Serpico, the Knapp Commission in New York. So there was a lot of police corruption too, which is how some of these guys were able to operate, from that side of the law as well. So yeah, there was money changing hands, and there was a lot of money being made with heroin, especially back then in the 1970s.
Scott, we actually have a question from one of our online viewers. And he asks, when they were trafficking guns from Florida, bringing in guns from Florida, did they buy the 22 caliber guns because of the silencers? I mean, what was the reason behind the 22s?
That's a good question. And they had other guns. They brought up some 38s and 45s as well, but the 22s seemed to be the ones that were used the most. Small, light, easy to carry, do a lot of damage, especially up close with the bullet ricocheting and all. And I think that was just the biggest batch that they were able to find. And they were actually linked them to 2 specific gun shops where they went in and purchased these large amounts of guns to traffic back up to New York City. So really the 22 by default became kind of that mob hit weapon, at least for a time there, for sure.
Very interesting.
Thank you.
I noticed Carmine Galante's birthplace was on that one of those maps there. Was that just a point of interest, or was he related somehow too?
I think I'll pull that map up real quick because that's kind of interesting. There's a few things that aren't strictly Purple Gang related, but yeah, just showing like Joe Valachi was raised in East Harlem. Carmine Galante, like you said, was born there. There's the Ciro Terranova up at the top here. Ciro Terranova. Joseph Pagano, who was a big Genovese member in Rockland County in upstate New York, was born there. But here, like some of these guys like Ray Rosildo, Tommy D'Ambrosia, these are Purple Gang affiliated guys. So they all grow up in this, really small, kind of tight-knit area. So, yeah, a lot of really interesting mob history in East Harlem for sure.
This is we have another online question. So
Sure.
another fairly specific question. So if you can't answer, it's okay. What street crew did Tommy Karate Patera come from?
Oh, I know it's somewhere in the back of my mind, but I can't think of it right off the top.
This is one of those things where, and Scott's made reference to this a couple of times. There are folks online, who follow this stuff even more closely than mob historians. Sometimes they know things that are amazing.
Yeah. Well, as a scientist, I like to call us mobologists.
Mobologists,
So,
sorry.
yes, that's the term we'll use from now on. So, I think I went over there.
It's not really a question, it's more of thoughts. Do you think perhaps they got the name Purple Gang because of the violence? The original Purple Gang were incredibly violent. And you said these guys kind of followed in their footsteps. So I wonder if maybe that was the connection of where the name came from.
Yeah, and a lot of people say that that's kind of how that name, whether it started by the media or law enforcement or even the guys themselves, that attachment was really indicative of the violence and how violent they were. And they were pretty wild and unpredictable, especially in the early years, in the early 70s when they were just getting started. So, yeah, that's a good point. Good point.
All right. Well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Scott Deitche, for a great program.
Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.